Thank you very much for showing up. So just to get an idea, what do people here, how many of you would say that you know anything about Julian Assange's case? A lot, a little, a bit? Yeah, you? A little bit? A little bit? Okay, a fair amount, right? So just to give people an idea, the reason we called the title, because I was asked for a title of the subject matter, and I called it Guilty of Journalism, the Prosecution of Julian Assange and the Future of Media Freedom. And that's partially because there's a book that someone I know who also covers the case, he published it recently called Guilty of Journalism, and I was trying to figure out what would be a good title. And I think that's an excellent title because you have really an unprecedented prosecution in the literal sense of unprecedented. It is without precedent in the history of the United States that a publisher is being criminally prosecuted using a 1917 law, the Espionage Act, which was established to prosecute German spies during the First World War. And so some of you may be aware more than others, but in brief, Julian Assange, who is quite a brilliant computer technologist, established a website called WikiLeaks, and he did so using his computer skills, and he established various means for sources and whistleblowers to be able to leak material to WikiLeaks securely. In fact, many websites now use some of the things that he himself helped to develop. So many of you, because some of you are still students, you may take for granted that the New York Times or the Guardian, they have on their websites for anonymous donations or leaking of material like a Dropbox type option, or secure anonymous leaking of information. And that's something that WikiLeaks first established in order to protect sources, because in this digital age, you know, if you submit information, you transmit it via the internet in any kind of way, this is all being monitored, which is of course something that whistleblower Edward Snowden helped to expose, that every single phone call we make, every text message we send, every email we receive is being absorbed and consumed and recorded and stored by a system whose reach is almost unlimited, but whose regulation is almost non-existent. And although it was known to a few people in 2006, 7, 8, WikiLeaks came to prominence to a greater audience, and Julian Assange as well, as a result of his publication in coordination and collaboration with mainstream establishment news sites, El País, Le Monde Diplomatique, New York Times, The Guardian, Der Spiegel, and they published what are now today known as, and at the time also known as, the Iraq War Logs, the Afghanistan War Diaries, the Guantanamo Bay detainee files, which had files showing the treatment of the hundreds upon hundreds of people who've been picked up off the streets and elsewhere in Afghanistan, Pakistan, elsewhere, and shipped off to this legal twilight zone in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, which is run by the Americans, despite the fact that the Cubans have been demanding that the territory be returned since the Cuban Revolution in the 1950s. So for decades, Cuba has been saying this is illegally occupied Cuba. And then also what's known as Cablegate, or diplomatic cables, the US diplomatic cables. And just to give you an idea of the kinds of things that were revealed in, just briefly, and I'm going to be quoting from an article that I helped to do research for, but just to give you an idea of the kinds of things that were revealed in these hundreds of thousands of pages of material that were leaked to Julian Assange. And this is what's important for people to understand. He is a publisher and a journalist, in fact, a multiple award-winning publisher and journalist. He is not a leaker, right, or a whistleblower. He did not work in the US military or in any of these government agencies. And in fact, they've published material on countries all over the world, including Kenya. I mean, there's a change in government in Kenya as a result of the exposure of massive levels of corruption of the Kenyan government that the subsequent Kenyan government had investigated and had a report about, but then kept secret. I think they were worried about the consequences, and then when WikiLeaks published that material, that resulted in that government ultimately like losing power. So there have been very real-world consequences. Oh, the UK Supreme Court had ruled that material that has been revealed by WikiLeaks can be used in trials as evidence, right? So that was something that was challenged all the way up, and they found that if you're filing civil suits or criminal cases and you want to use like evidence, that you can use the material that is the raw material that has been published by WikiLeaks. I mean, that is the level. It's also been used by the European Court of Human Rights. For example, in the case of Khalid Elmaazi, who was a Lebanese German citizen. I think I've got that right. He could be Syrian German, but I think Lebanese German, who is on holiday, gets picked up by the CIA. He's on holiday with his family. He gets grabbed up by a van. This is what they call like a black bag operation, whisked away, where he's tortured for months. The family have no idea where he is. They don't even know he's been picked up. I think he might have been on his own, taking a walk. They end up back in Lebanon because this is months pass. And it's like, where's Dad? Where's my husband? He's being brutally tortured. Eventually, the Americans realize that they've got the wrong guy. It turns out there's more than one Khalid Elmaazi in the world. Surprise, surprise. But they still don't release him because now they're concerned about what might happen. He continues to be tortured. And then eventually he's released, I think it was in Macedonia. Like, he gets driven up, move forward. He says, at this point, I think I'm going to be executed. And they close up the van and they drive away. And nobody believes him. And he's trying to bring a lawsuit. And of course, he suffers terrible PTSD. I mean, he discusses sometimes what they did to him. And then it's the WikiLeaks cables, when they get published, that help to corroborate his case. And the European Court of Human Rights finds in his favor, right? The European Court of Human Rights, WikiLeaks cables also show that the US government was applying pressure on the German government to drop their investigation into the CIA officers that had picked him up. So these are the types of things that are being exposed, and exposed especially about the US empire, unsurprisingly, because the documents come from the US Armed Forces and the US State Department. So let me just pick up, here are the kinds of things that have been, just to give you an idea, that were also published about in The Guardian and the New York Times and elsewhere, based on their collaboration with WikiLeaks, which was the first time in their lives, because if you know anything about journalism, most journalists, especially establishment journalists, are very competitive. It's all about who publishes first, right? I'm not going to work with someone from the Washington Post, bless you, if I'm with the New York Times. Many of us in the independent media sphere are more likely to collaborate, but this was unusual, and it was Julian Assange that insisted on this, to ensure that there was a greater level of exposure in different languages, in different countries, of the material, because that's what he cared about. He wanted the material to be exposed. And he wanted it also to have lasting power, right? Because if multiple newspapers are publishing multiple articles in multiple countries, and especially if they're legacy, establishment, mainstream media outlets, that has got greater level of lasting power. It's less likely to fall down the memory hole. So here are some of the things that he made public, or that WikiLeaks made public, and he helped to make public as its publisher, as its founder, working with these establishment outlets that he sought out, and he forced them to come and work together. And many of them testified in the main extradition hearing. And just I realize I haven't mentioned this yet. He's gone through a couple of years now of extradition hearings. He's currently being kept now over 5 years in Belmarsh prison. That's the highest security prison we have in this country, that is known informally as Britain's Guantanamo, right? Before Julian was being kept there, it's been known. I've interviewed people who were kept in Belmarsh. High suicide rate. In fact, he knew somebody there had committed suicide while he was there. So it's not pleasant conditions. You have to ask yourself, why are they keeping him in what Americans would call a maximum security facility, right? He hasn't, for pre-trial detention, on remand. So currently he's still fighting his extradition to the United States, and he's in an appeal stage. But before I get to that, and that we might get into questions, let me just quote a couple of the things that he helped to make public. And you guys can look up, and I can send you links to the articles which refer to this, as well as the actual WikiLeaks website. And I'd all encourage you to go to the WikiLeaks website. Just go to the website, go to the homepage, and just look at the different subject matter And you can imagine the level of effort that they took and the people they worked with to make this readable and digestible. And the great thing about WikiLeaks, which almost no site has ever done before, is that they create this sort of digital library. So researchers, journalists, historians, lawyers, fact checkers can go and see the raw material. It's not just the New York Times telling you that a document says, quote, A, B, and C, end quote. You can go and then look at the document yourself from start to finish. So, Julian Assange made public the killing of nearly 700 civilians who had approached too closely to US convoys and checkpoints, including pregnant women, the blind and deaf, and at least 30 children. That's in Iraq. He made public the more than 15,000 unreported deaths of Iraqi civilians and the torture and abuse of some 800 men and boys aged 14 to 89 at Guantanamo Bay detention camp. He showed us that Hillary Clinton in 2009 ordered US diplomats to spy on US Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and other UN representatives from China, France, Russia, and the UK, spying that included encouraging them to obtain DNA iris scans, right, of the eye, fingerprints, and personal passwords of UN representatives and the UN Secretary General. He exposed that Obama, Hillary Clinton, and the CIA backed the June 2009 military coup in Honduras that overthrew the democratically elected president, Manuel Zelaya, replacing him with a murderous and corrupt military regime. He revealed that the United States secretly launched missile, bomb, and drone attacks on Yemen, killing scores of civilians. Obviously, there were Yemeni journalists who were also exposing that, but there is material that came out that also assisted in relation to pre-Saudi invasion in relation to that. And then, of course, there are the Vault 7 leaks, the largest ever CIA leak in history, which exposed the CIA cyber warfare program. We can get into that afterwards, which is ultimately what led, we are told, according to whistleblowers and various sources that spoke to Yahoo News and whistleblowers from, which we can get into, to the security firm, which was supposed to be protecting Julian Assange and the Ecuadorian embassy. They were hired by the Ecuadorian government because Julian Assange had asylum there. And then that same company, UC Global, which is a Spanish-Portuguese firm, ended up double dealing with the CIA and then ended up spying on Julian Assange while he was in the embassy and feeding information back to the CIA. And these are some of the things that were raised, actually. So after these publications are exposed and these publications are made, Julian Assange discovers that he is told, at least, that there's a secret indictment against him, and he's got to a secret indictment in the US and that he's at risk. He ends up getting asylum at the Ecuadorian embassy. 7 years later, he's dragged out when there's a new government that comes into power in Ecuador. They allow the Met Police to drag him out. He ends up at Belmarsh prison. And for the last 5+ years, he's been fighting his extradition to be sent to the United States. And the arguments which have been presented by the lawyers against extradition, because the important thing for people to understand is, under the agreement that Britain has with the United States, and this was signed, the extradition treaty was signed after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. So this is a 2003 extradition treaty. There is a presumption in favor of extradition to the United States. It's not the same way the other way around. So if the Americans say, we want Mohammed for these crimes, and that these crimes are similar to crimes you have in your country, and this is the same Mohammed that we want, it's not a different Mohammed, it's not the wrong guy, then it's down to me, to you or me, to then convince the judge why I should not go there. So the presumption is in favor, right? So it's like the opposite. The burden of proof is shifted onto the defendant. And the case they presented is, well, this is a politically motivated prosecution. The treaty does not allow extradition for politically motivated offenses. This case, and now this brings us now to the title of this meeting, or this discussion, this case is a grave threat, represents a grave threat to media freedom and freedom of speech and the freedom of press, and what he's done is protected under Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights, Article 10 of the Human Rights Act, and the First Amendment of the United States, right? Because journalists publish secrets all the time, right? They publish documents and expose these things like this all the time. And interestingly enough, no one else is being prosecuted for this. And all of these arguments were rejected, bar one about the risk to his health, which was then reversed on appeal. And now he's got a final appeal in the High Court where he's going to be able to argue. Here's the other thing. And this is now, I'm going to wrap up now. I'm going to wrap up on this point, and we can have any questions or answers or clarifications that people may want. The United States is seeking to use its domestic criminal law against a publisher for publishing activities who's not a United States citizen, he's an Australian citizen, that he engaged in outside of the United States. He was not physically in the United States. His source was based in Iraq, the US Army whistleblower Chelsea Manning, who leaked the material to him when she was based in Iraq. He was based between whatever it is, Iceland and the United Kingdom and various other countries. And they're also saying, so basically they're saying that they can prosecute anyone anywhere in the world. I mean, that's got to be the argument, right? That is essentially the argument. Our domestic criminal law, which was designed to go against spies, we're now using it for the first time in history to go against a journalist and a publisher who they like to pretend he's not a real journalist, he's a hacker, they try to say, because he's a computer expert, and when he was like very young, back when he was in Australia, he used to do some hacking, as you know, but that's like calling, let's say I stole a car when I was a kid for a joyride when I was 15, and then after I go to law school, I graduate from law school, I practice law, and then the media start referring to me as a car thief, right? It doesn't matter that, you know, I'm a practicing lawyer. Well, he's a registered, he's accredited as a journalist. He's a member of the Journalists Union in Australia. He's a multiple award-winning journalist and publisher. And not only are they saying they can prosecute him, have him dragged to the United States to face prosecution before a jury that will come from the Eastern District of Virginia, which is where the CIA headquarters is based, which is where there's a headquarters of Homeland Security, a Department of Defense, FBI, all have their headquarters there, which means, as a jury expert explained to the court, all of the members of the jury will work there, or used to work there, or have family members who work there, because there's no other reason to live in that area. And that is why they've issued the indictment there, so that you'll have a national security jury. But because he's not a United States citizen, he will not be allowed to argue, this is what they say, and there is legal precedent for this, he will not be able to argue that he has protections under the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, which, like Article 10 here, guarantees the right to free expression and the right to journalistic activity. So we can prosecute you here in this country for actions you took over there, but you don't have the same protections that a United States citizen would. It's totally Kafkaesque, and it is a complete threat to the very foundation of media freedom, to the right to receive and impart information. And I encourage people to go and look to see the kinds of materials that were revealed about Netanyahu, for example, or the Turkish state and its treatment of the Kurds, for example, that you can go and find. Anyone can go in there and search the database like you would search in the search engine and type in key phrases and consider what it will mean if he's allowed to be sent to the United States to face a maximum of 175 years in prison, which is what he faces under 18 charges, an 18-charge indictment, 17 charges of which are under the U.S. Espionage Act. And that is why people need to think about what it means for media freedom in an environment where the right to know is closing in. You know, I will actually end on this point. How many Palestinian journalists have been murdered in Gaza? Like, directly, deliberately assassinated. We're talking about over 100 media workers right now, which is, you know, should be directly relevant to the people at this encampment. And not only them, but members of their family. I've been told by somebody they received a phone call from a journalist there, who they were speaking to, actually. They were speaking to them, and they said they'd received a phone call from members of the Israeli military who said, if you continue reporting, we're going to kill you and we're going to kill your family. And given the fact that there have been hundreds of journalists murdered, more than any other conflict in recorded history, right? Or according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, which is an establishment press freedom organization based in the United States, a mainstream press freedom organization. Well, why are they doing that? In order to silence and reduce media coverage and eliminate people's ability to access alternative information on the ground. Well, why is the United States bringing a criminal prosecution against Julian Assange, and then who knows who else afterwards if they're successful? to make it very clear that there are certain parameters of reporting that they will accept, for now at least, and anything outside of that is out of bounds. And so with that, I'll bring this to an end, and if anyone has any questions, please let me know. Yeah. So for those of you who didn't hear, basically the question is, what has it been like to be able to access what's going on inside for those of us who are not in the main courtroom because of the quality of the video link access? So that's a very important question because as the old saying goes, it's not enough for justice to be done, it must be seen to be done. And all too often, the quality of the picture might be decent, but the quality of the sound has been so poor that there have been times, literally anybody who's following the case via video link access, either in a separate media room, a spillover room as they call it, in the court building, or at home or in their office, getting via the video link, you can't hear what's going on. And there have been times where it's been so bad, journalists have just walked out of the media room, including the editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks, Kristinn Hrafnsson, who's a well-respected Icelandic journalist who took over as editor-in-chief after Julian was arrested. And for some reason, he was denied access to the main courtroom, even though he's been at every single hearing, as I have, and ended up walking out in frustration. So it can be incredibly difficult. I've been able to cover both inside the main courtroom, at times the media spillover room. When we can't hear anything, we send messages in the chat, even though there's strict instructions. Do not drop any messages in the chat. You're here to observe only. And then people are talking and they can't hear what the hell is going on. And it's like, oh, we have to. So then someone will break the fear barrier, because we're all journalists there, fear barrier, and just be like, I can't hear anything. And then eventually the judges will say, okay, we're being told the connection's not good, so we're going to rise and then go back in. And there are times where it's been quite a fiasco. Other times where it's been decent. But you might be surprised how poor the sound quality is, how poor the setup is, given this is an advanced first world capitalist state, that you would think that audio-video link to court hearings work. Right? I mean, if this was in a third world country, you'd never hear the end of it from the same media. Like, what is this, some backwards third world country? Oh, but it's Britain. You'll have some grumblings, but it's like, no, this is a backward first world country. And it's kind of outrageous, actually. There's also oh, go ahead. Intentional. This is what I would say. I mean, the more court cases you've covered, and I have covered other cases, I mean, this is just one case that I cover, the more you realize how poorly and incompetently run so many aspects of the state is, especially because of under-resourcing, deliberate underfunding and cuts to budgets over a decade. So that in of itself, okay, that is deliberate with the knowledge of the consequences of those actions, even if it's not deliberate for a certain case. I'll tell you one thing that is deliberate. Whatever we want to say, and I have my criticisms of how the main extradition hearing was conducted, which was in Westminster Magistrates Court, because all extradition hearings are decided in the Magistrates Court, and then if you appeal, and you can appeal, it goes to the High Court, and then possibly the Supreme Court. The Court of Appeal is skipped. Whatever you want to say about that, at least she granted video link access to journalists and some other people, like Amnesty-type groups, outside of the UK. For some reason, we're currently at the High Court appeal stage where these judges, the default position is if you're outside of England and Wales, you will not be granted video link access. So, okay, so he's an Australian citizen being sought by the United States government. There are major implications for Americans, right? Freedom of speech, etc. Major implications for Australians. The majority of Australians want him back, but you can't have Australian and American journalists following what's going on, even if they can show they have been covering it before, right, during the magistrates court, and they've even come in. And I was telling people, tell the court, tell them that you've come personally, point out, say I'm a multiple award-winning journalist, Chris Hedges, for example, who I work with, who's based in the United States. I kind of wrote some bullet points of things to argue, and bear in mind I said England and Wales, so even if you were in Scotland, that's the same situation. Now that's deliberate. They could have said, okay, if you were granted before and you haven't done anything wrong on the video link, then why not be granted it this time? So the debate, there's always a debate even when I was working in the legal field before I ended up in journalism, and we used to deal with loads of refugee applications and dealing with the Home Office, but between conspiracy and incompetence. And that's always what the two things go back and forth with, conspiracy and incompetence. But quite often even the incompetence has a conspiratorial element. Like I said, when you cut a budget, so you have 10% of the staff to deal with an increased amount of applications, that means that the average person will be screwed over unless they want a case to be dealt with well, right? So if it was the most important thing in the world for them to absolutely guarantee that the sound could come through, then it would, right? Like people would say, do what it takes. Like, this is done all the time. You have conferences, it's not supreme, it shouldn't be that complicated. So that's the best answer I can give in relation to that question about conspiracy or incompetence.
I had a second question as well.
Yeah?
What do you think we can do in Cambridge, but just university students across the country, in relation to Julian Assange's case?
So what can university students across the country do in relation to Julian Assange's case? Well, first of all, kind of informing yourself about the case and the significance of the case. I don't know if I mentioned this, but his lawyer-client privileged communications were being spied on, right? Indirectly on behalf of the Central Intelligence Agency. That should have killed the case right there, right? That should have poisoned the case beyond recovery. It was revealed that there was a plot by the CIA to kidnap or assassinate him while he was in the embassy. A Yahoo News article cited around 33 current and former official national security officials who confirmed the story that under Donald Trump and Mike Pompeo, who is then CIA head, that there was plans drawn up which included the possibility of a shootout in the streets of London to have Julian Assange poisoned, assassinated, or kidnapped out of the embassy. And you have to think about the implications of that and how that was not enough to get the High Court to bar. What they said is, but it seems that the CIA were concerned that Julian was going to flee from the embassy to Russia. But if he's extradited to the United States, well, then there's no problem. So it's like, okay, but it's not a death penalty offense to want to go to Russia, which, by the way, was a false story anyway, right? It's not a death penalty. Like we have no death penalty in this country. So their willingness to even jettison that. So once you get yourself informed as university students, the second thing is to realize the interconnected nature of the right to know, the assault on media freedom, which is not only happening in Julian's case or happening in Gaza against Palestinian journalists being murdered en masse and their families, but is also happening in terms of algorithmic manipulation here. It's happening in terms of the National Security Act, which now people, including journalists, face up to life in prison if they publish information that is restricted information without authorization under certain circumstances. And there's it's very clear that they're looking at Julian's case and they're saying, oh, look what the Americans are trying to do. Let's see if we can get in a law that will allow us to do this as well. So if you're a student and you think it's important for you as a student and the wider human race to be able to know what the centers of power are doing and to be able to shine a light into the corridors of power, as Chris Hedges likes to say, or to be able to hold a mirror up to society, as Amira Hass, the Israeli journalist, likes to say, well, then it's fundamental that Julian is not extradited to face multiple life sentences for the crime of journalism. And it's fundamental that the chilling effect that has already occurred is stopped and reversed. So what can people do? They can write to their members of parliament. People can kind of roll their eyes. But if you look at what's going on now, you have had a letter that was signed by multiple current and former heads of state around the world, from like the Venezuelan president to former Argentinian president, not Bolsonaro, Lula da Silva, who is now once again the head of the Brazilian government, who signed it, the Mexican president, AMLO, and many other high-ranking state officials signing it, saying Julian shouldn't be extradited, the Council of Europe, Finally, now the Australian Prime Minister forced into doing this. There's a parliament cross-party from right-wing, like seriously right-wing, all the way to liberal and quite progressive in Australia. MPs coming out demanding that Julian is released. Well, that didn't happen overnight. That's as a result of years and years and years of people campaigning. And whether people realize it or not, a short, concise letter that constituents send to their members of parliament saying, you know, this extradition is a threat to media freedom, as the human rights expert of the Council of Europe, which we're a part of, has said multiple times, right? Julian Assange has been a victim of torture, as the UN torture expert has said multiple times, right? He must not be extradited to the United States. We demand that you put pressure on the government to put pressure on Joe Biden, who has the ability to drop the prosecution. This is a political decision. Joe Biden, who promised that when he came into power, the assaults on journalism and journalists that Donald Trump had initiated would come to an end. Well, this prosecution was initiated under Donald J. Trump and Mike Pompeo, as well as the idea that they might be able to assassinate him or kidnap him. And he hasn't stopped it. In fact, when they lost the case originally, on health grounds, they appealed it and got it reversed. So contacting your MP, I know for a fact from speaking to current and former MPs, when you get even a few dozen emails on the same subject or letters, short, concise, not like raving 500-page manifestos, because they'll just throw that into the trash. They listen. Whether they want to pretend to listen, they don't. Lobbying works. That's why lobby groups lobby, right? The more pressure you get, that's something that's very simple. Informing people as well, writing resolutions, declaring your solidarity, recognizing the war crimes and crimes against humanity which have been exposed as a result, as a direct result of the publishing of which the publishing activities of Julian Assange, for which he faces criminal prosecution, right? All those stories, all those examples of the war crimes and crimes against humanity that I cited, right, the massacres of innocent civilians in Iraq, the torture of people in Guantanamo Bay, etc. These are among the files that he's being prosecuted for publishing. Even though other sites won awards, including the New York Times, won awards for their reporting on this. So, you know, inform yourself, inform others, letters of solidarity and support, and try to understand the wider implications of what is going on in terms of the assault on media freedom. Because if journalists can't publish, right, then, you know, how do you become informed about what is going on here, what the halls of power are engaged in, what the state is engaged in? What major, I mean, the amount that has been revealed in terms of corporate wrongdoing, environmental wrongdoing that has come via WikiLeaks is also quite astonishing. Major trade, so-called free trade deals that have collapsed in no small part because WikiLeaks, the final or second to final penultimate draft of the trade deal was leaked to WikiLeaks, and after they published it and it was reported on, it became almost impossible. Like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was designed to create a parallel regime so corporations can sue countries and governments in arbitration court, corporate courts, for laws that they say impact their profits, including environmental protection laws and regulations, climate change regulations, and other kinds of regulations. And that collapsed, no small part because this was leaked to WikiLeaks. Well, if WikiLeaks, if Julian Assange can be criminally prosecuted, anyone can be criminally prosecuted, and then how do we know? You know, it's a truism to say we don't know what we don't know. And we all like to pretend that, you know, being intelligent means nothing, that you need to be informed. I can think I'm really smart, but like, what difference does that make if I do not have verifiable, credible, and reliable information with which to make informed decisions as an individual and with other individuals?
I have a question. It's not really, it's kind of half-formed, based on all the stuff you just said.
Sorry, could you speak just a little bit louder?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about in terms of Assange and the targeting of journalists in like Palestine. I guess, I know, you know, the title of your talk, Guilty of Journalism and the Future of Media Freedom. It feels like there's a lot of darkness around this topic. I guess, do you see any light?
So there's a lot of darkness around this topic. Do I see any light? Absolutely. So A couple of weeks ago, the High Court, even though they dismissed 95% of the appeal arguments, tragically and frighteningly, the core ones, especially about media freedom, and they amazingly said that it's not illegal to extradite someone for political offenses now from the UK, which means that includes what? The United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, any country that Britain has an extradition treaty with. The light is this: the High Court did say they have a serious problem with the idea that Julian Assange would be discriminated against based on his citizenship, which is an argument that the United States government itself posed in its favor. So they basically said, because he's not a US citizen, that he won't have the same media freedom rights, constitutional rights, and the High Court has said that this is an issue for them. That it is at least arguable, so they've allowed an appeal on this point, it is at least arguable that he should not be extradited if he will be discriminated against based on citizenship, because if the roles were reversed, the European Convention of Human Rights guarantees rights for human beings, not for citizens, right? So a US citizen would be able to assert first freedom of speech rights. It doesn't mean that he'll win on them, but they are saying he should at least be able to assert them, to raise them as a defense, the same way a US citizen could raise them as a defense. And the High Court has said, yes, it is arguable that this is a legitimate point. And I wonder to what extent this would have happened if it wasn't the fact that there has been years of organizing, mobilizing, pressure on members of parliament, writing to The Guardian, the New York Times, telling them that they've screwed up with their reporting, that they're misreporting on certain things, that they're downplaying the seriousness of the case. I mean, we're talking about years. You know, the people who are the unsung heroes more than anyone else, other than of course Julian's family and his wife, are the relentless campaigners, like the Julian Assange Defense Committee, or just like everyday people who have jobs and families and what have you, who have put enormous pressure to keep this going and protesting outside of every single court hearing and writing, like I said, writing about it, and helping to ensure that the story is kept alive. So yes, I would say, although who knows what the High Court is going to do, and I suggest people look to Declassified UK, as well as the Dissenter.org, where I publish, and Consortium News as well, where I publish. This is all online. And they've been around for years. Consortium News going back to the 90s, one of the first English online news outlets, founded by the late award-winning investigative journalist Robert Perry, who helped to expose the Iran-Contra scandal when he was at the Associated Press. If people go to these sites, you can see, and especially Declassified UK, their reviews of the judges in this case and their connections to the national security state, to help people understand the nature of the state and the nature of the judicial branch of the state as well, that these people are where they are because they're deemed to be a safe pair of hands, right? So, you know, if this case is allowed to go on silently in the dark, I don't know that even these appeal grounds would have been allowed, right? It makes a difference. You know, we like to pretend that the rule of law means whatever the media is saying, it doesn't make a difference. Whatever the public is saying, it doesn't make a difference. But it does make a difference, especially in political cases. Right? It makes sense that a politically motivated case is more likely to have a political solution, a politically motivated solution, as it were. It depends on how much pressure is kept up. So people should keep their focus on this, because this will be the last ever hearing in the UK unless somehow it goes to the Supreme Court, which is highly, highly unlikely. His only other opportunity is to the European Court of Human Rights if he loses. But there's also a fear that the Brits will just bundle him up on a plane and fly him up to the States before he can appeal to the European Court of Human Rights, or before the European Court of Human Rights comes back with a response. So, yeah, any other questions?
I got a question.
Yeah.
So, how do you account for the accusation of rape, how that played itself out in Julian Assange's case?
So when Julian Assange was working on the release of the Iraq war logs, the Afghanistan war logs, Guantanamo Bay detainee files, there were sex assault allegations that had been raised in Sweden, because he was in Sweden as part of his European tour and working on this stuff. The primary place of work was in Britain. But they didn't, I mean, unfortunately, that dealt like a very heavy blow on his support, especially here in the UK, because it made it sort of kryptonite. I mean, the interesting thing is it shouldn't matter. Like, there are principles. I mean, this is something that, you know, I was raised to believe in, and I thought everyone in sort of Western societies were in terms of criminal law, right? That if the state is prosecuting someone for journalism, then you can't allow whether or not you like or dislike the individual, because they're not prosecuting him for anything else in relation to the allegations in Sweden. And sadly, the reporting was really quite awful in terms of the Sweden case, because they neglected to mention all manner of things. The fact that when Julian was in Sweden, it appeared that certain allegations were being raised. And so he remained in Sweden, and we know this for a fact. And I suggest that people go and read the UN torture expert's interview in the Swiss publication, I think it's Republik, called by Nils Melzer, or his book. I mean, it's a brilliant book, and it helps the fact that by chance he's fluent in Swedish. So, and he's a legal expert as well. So he was able to review the Swedish documents, which loads of people who don't know Swedish weren't able to. But before he left Sweden, he got a lawyer, and he said, okay, fine, let me deal with these allegations. And after a couple of weeks, he's like, look, I'm not even a Swedish citizen, and I've got to go. He's doing the Iraq war logs. This is a massive release of the world's largest ever release of like classified cables relating to war crimes. So eventually his lawyer gets an email saying, okay, yeah, fine, you can go. He gets on an airplane to go back to London, and then all of a sudden he finds out, either on the plane or when he lands in London, that a European arrest warrant has been issued for him. And under allegations of sex assault allegations. And then somehow the alleged victims' details are leaked, right? So it's like, well, that's violation of Swedish criminal law. Like, you're not allowed to reveal the identity of people, either alleged victims or alleged perpetrators. So there's already an issue there. Why on earth would they have tell him he can leave only to then issue an arrest warrant? And so yeah, unfortunately, there's all kinds of issues with that case. It's highly, highly suspect, especially given the fact that after he finally was forced out of the embassy, the Swedish case dissolves. So he says, he goes to the embassy, gets asylum, because he says, I'm more than happy to go to Sweden, but I have been tipped off by a source in the United States that actually that's a ruse so that I can be picked up and extradited to the United States, because they believe, rightly, that the Swedish state is even more willing to give up a journalist or whoever to the Americans than, say, Britain, where you might have a bit more ability to push back. Sweden is a smaller, weaker country, basically. The judiciary and the prosecution there are more pliable. And people were saying, oh, this is ludicrous. There's no evidence, including the courts here, so there's no evidence that the Americans are after you. And the lawyers, including the Ecuadorian government, tried to negotiate with the Swedes and say, sign a document, a legally binding document, saying that you will not extradite him to the United States. And we're happy to let him leave. And he's happy to go. And the lawyers, and I saw the former Ecuadorian ambassador to the UK say this, Guillermo Long, if I've pronounced his name correctly, I hope I did. So I mean, he explained in English. There's a long interview I saw him do with the Grey Zone's Max Blumenthal and former Grey Zone Ben Norton journalist, former Grey Zone journalist Ben Norton, who explains this in detail. And I've spoken to the former Ecuadorian consul Fidel Narvaez. He said the same thing. So this has been made very clear. The Swedes refused, and the Brits refused. And when the Swedes were finally under pressure by the judges to either to come here to London to speak to Julian, or to drop what was then called a preliminary investigation. There were never charges. That was mass misreporting in the press here. We know from Freedom of Information Act requests, emails from Keir Starmer's Crown Prosecution Service, when Keir Starmer was the chief of the Crown Prosecution Service, the director of public prosecutions, emails from prosecutors here to Swedish prosecutor there saying, don't you dare get cold feet. That's the quote, cold feet. Don't you dare get cold feet. Don't you think this is just any other case? Well, what does that tell you? Why are the Brits saying that to the Swedes? I thought it's the Swedes that want him. The Brits don't care. So he's pulled out of the embassy. The Swedish case just dissolves. It evaporates. Nobody even remembers the Swedish case. But the damage was done in terms of affecting the support, like you raised. And now, lo and behold, there's a secret indictment. That's no longer a secret indictment. There's a massive 18 charges come against him, and he faces 175 years in prison. So it's like, it's amazing how, you know, it can be difficult, because whenever people hear certain things like sex assault charges, or not even charges, in this case just accusations, or allegations, apparent allegations, which, like I say, if you read Nils Melzer's report on this, is itself highly suspect. There's lots of evidence of police coercion on the part of these two alleged complainants. And sadly, okay, the great thing is, it's no longer an issue. The tragic thing is, it impacted the support that Julian had from the wider public, I think because of the yuck factor or what have you, even though...
People who don't pay attention to the defamation he made, people still think, oh, well, he's being held for that reason.
Oh yeah, there are people who think that this might have to do with Sweden or the 2016 US election. It does not, nor has it ever had anything to do with that. You can look at the indictment, right? The indictment is very clear what they're charging him with and what they're charging him for. And, you know, most of the charges carry a strict liability or semi-strict liability element, which means you don't have to prove harm. You don't even have to prove that anyone was harmed. Like, did you receive this information? Yes. Okay, guilty. Next charge, you know, maximum 10 years. Did you publish this information? Yes. Okay, guilty. Next. I mean, this is the kind of thing he faces. Bear in mind that this law wasn't designed for journalists. It's supposedly designed for spies over 100 years ago. And that law is for the first time in history being used to prosecute a publisher. And not only a publisher, a non-US publisher for publishing outside of the United States. It is the imperial application of domestic criminal law. Is that it? Cool?
Great, thanks you very much.
Yeah?